I was asked by a coworker to look at their high-priced edger, and I was taken back by its great condition. If I had to guess, I'd say it was only used sparingly in its lifetime. Now, you would think that if you were going to use one of these a few times a year that any old edger would do, but instead they bought a very good one. But it turns out just because you bought a good brand doesn't mean you have to treat it that way, and if that happens, just be prepared for a situation like this one. In today's video, we're going to be looking at this Stihl edger, and the problem is that it's been unused for quite some time, and they're not even sure if it's able to start and run. There's also a very strange situation that we need to bring up with this edger, and I'm not sure if I can come up with a very good answer for it. That'll make more sense here in a bit. Now, I'm going to try and repair this edger, but yours might be a little different, so this might not work on yours. So if things are not working out for you, like in the video, please ask about it, and I'll be glad to answer your questions. Now, my coworker didn't give me a lot of information about this edger, which is just fine by me. In fact, I like not knowing only because the information sometimes gets in the way of what's really going on. This one, however, is a real mystery, and when we get to it, I think you're going to agree with me. So the first thing I want to do is to take a look around and see if I see anything that might be concerning, and aside from the purge bulb being broken, I'd say this edger was almost perfect. The next thing we need to do is to check and make sure that this engine still starts and runs. Unfortunately, the fuel tank is empty, which typically means that whoever put it up did the right thing and got rid of the fuel that was in it, or it could have just evaporated. Unfortunately, after seeing the real issue it's having later on, you'll find out why the tank was empty. Now, to confirm that the engine isn't broken, I'm going to put some fuel into the carb's throat and then try starting it. So the strange part is, this engine ran for a lot longer than it should have. I almost wonder if there's nothing wrong with this edger, except for the fact that the purge bulb is broken and will no longer help to get fuel where it needs to go. So I'm going to test this out by putting some fuel into the tank and then try starting it. Now, this will be very difficult to start without a purge bulb to help out, so to prevent me from flooding the engine, I'm going to limit how many pulls I make. Who knows, maybe we'll get lucky and there'll be nothing wrong with it, and they'll get their edger back sooner than later. Unfortunately, things go from promising to real bad very quickly. As you can see, there's fuel dripping from the intake area, so it's either coming from the carb or the fuel line. Well, since we've already got fuel in it, I might as well try and start it and see what it does and doesn't do. Now, the good news is that the engine doesn't have any starting issues, but the bad news is that it won't stay running. So what do I think the issue is with this edger? Well, besides the fuel leak, it would seem that the carb isn't able to give enough fuel to the engine. That means we can either adjust the carb to give more fuel to the engine, or we can take the carb apart and see why it's not working like it's supposed to. The easiest thing to do would be to try and adjust the carb, but there's just one huge issue, and that is the mysterious part I mentioned earlier in the video. Now, this engine is not new. In fact, this edger should be well over 10 years old. There's just one strange fact about it, and that is, despite having the openings for the carb adjustment screws in the cover, this carb has no screws to adjust. In fact, the idle set screw is in the wrong location according to the opening for it. Now, this carb is something that you would see on a newer style engine where there are no adjustment screws. That would mean that this engine might have been serviced at some point, but it looks like they bought the wrong carb for it. Now, they had to have known that it was wrong, but installed it anyway. However, as you'll see here in a bit, there's something terribly wrong with this one. Now, I'm not against just ordering a new carb instead of just dealing with the headache of cleaning and servicing the old one. If that's what you want to do instead of dealing with the old one, go for it. However, just be careful what you order. Now, once we get the carb off the engine, there's going to be some more strange facts about it, and it's going to surprise you because, well, it surprised me. In fact, after looking at the fuel lines and the fuel tank grommets, these look almost brand new, so there's a good chance that I was right about it being serviced sometime in the past. Once we get the carb off the engine, I'll start to take it apart, starting with the metering section. Now, at this point, it hasn't dawned on me yet as to what's wrong with this carb, and if you're paying attention, you should be able to figure it out without me mentioning it. If you haven't figured it out, that's okay, but it'll be very apparent here in a bit. Now with the purge bulb section finally out of the way, we can finally see the metering diaphragm. Now typically when a carb is leaking fuel, you'll find that the metering diaphragm has petrified in the down position, but the strange part is that the diaphragm is in okay shape. And not only is it not stuck in the down position, it is in fact too far away from where it needs to be. So it's not the reason why this carb was leaking fuel. Now even though the diaphragm is not petrified, I'm still going to replace it anyway. After taking out the diaphragm, the next part I want to look at is the inlet screen under the pumping diaphragm. Now after taking off the plate, we can see the round inlet screen, and the good part is that it's clean of any dirt or debris. That means there's a good chance that this carb is not clogged in any way. In fact, it's spotless. So I have to wonder, why was it leaking fuel? And the answer might surprise you. The next thing I want to do is to check and see if fuel will pass through the inlet screen. Now after putting some fuel in the pocket of the screen, I'll then press the rocker arm on the other side of the carb and see if fuel will disappear through the screen, which it does. Now if yours doesn't, you'll need to remove the needle and rocker arm and clean the screen with carb cleaner until the cleaner is able to pass through it. Now since our fuel is flowing through the screen, we don't need to do that, and we can start to put the carb back together again. Now if you haven't figured it out yet, I'll let you in on a sobering fact, and that is I never verified where the carb was leaking at. The reason why is because I just assumed the carb was leaking because of a bad diaphragm, which as you just saw couldn't be the case. Wait until you see where it was leaking from. Now once the carb is back on the engine, I'll finally realize where the leak is really coming from, but until then, I'll take this chance to replace the purge bulb. Now if you have to order some of these, try ordering a multi-pack of 3 or more, that way each one will be very inexpensive. Also, make sure there's a gasket sitting between the carb and the engine, and that it has 1 or 2 small openings in it for the impulses to work the pump inside the carb. If not, there's a good chance the carb isn't going to work like it's supposed to. Now, I've got a pretty good idea as to what happened to this edger, but it's not going to be obvious until we try and get it started. After that, though, I think you might agree with me as well. Now, I am not a big fan when it comes to this type of fuel line. The main reason being is that I can't see if fuel is flowing through them. Now, this type of fuel line is very resilient when it comes to ethanol fuels, but eventually they'll break down as well. So for me, I would typically choose to use a yellow fuel line instead, just to make things a bit easier to see when it comes to fuel flow to the carb. Now, once I get some fuel in the tank, I'll then purge the air from the lines and get ready to start it, or at least that's what I thought I was going to do. After pressing the bulb a few times, I was finally able to see fuel start to flow in the bulb, and that's when I noticed that the carb was still leaking fuel, but it was coming from somewhere I've never seen it come from before. It was leaking from the lower part of the carb around the plate that covers the pumping diaphragm. Now, I've never seen a leak from this area before, and after looking at it for quite a while, I realized there was a casting issue with the metal, and that's the reason why it was leaking. So at this point, I decided to order a new carb, but this time, I was going to order one that was meant for this engine with fuel adjustment screws. As you just saw, the carb I took off the engine was labeled as a Zama carb made for Stihl. It was not a cheap aftermarket part, and yet it was leaking from a very strange part of the carb. Now, the one I took off the engine was missing the fuel adjustment screws, which could only mean one thing. At some point, someone serviced this edger and decided to replace the carb with either a new OEM one or possibly one from a different newer machine, and that's how I got the carb that was on it, which unfortunately might have caused the owner to put it away to deal with at a later time. Now, the reason why I didn't notice the exact location where it was leaking fuel was because the first time it happened, the machine was intact, which meant finding the leak was going to be very difficult. Besides, carbs really only leak in one way, which is out of the throat of the carb. However, the second time I noticed it was with most of the intake off the engine. So I was able to see exactly where the leak was coming from that time. It really doesn't matter now because we've got a brand new carb ready for it, and even though it's only a cheap aftermarket one, I've never had one of these leak in that way. But maybe I should wait until we install it, otherwise I might just jinx myself. So I finally had to mix a fresh batch of fuel because I was almost out. Now, even though I don't have an issue mixing fuel, I still want to be able to do it without a lot of thought. So putting 1 ounce of oil into a 40-ounce glass jar and filling it with gasoline is about as easy as it gets. Unless you want to mix a gallon at a time, which I think is quite a lot of fuel to use by a typical homeowner in a reasonable amount of time, what usually happens is that it'll go stale by the end of the summer before they ever get through the gallon. Now at this point, I'm ready to purge the air from the lines and check for any fuel leaks, which I hate to say I don't think I've ever had when using a brand new carb, so this was a lot less dramatic than repairing an original carb. While I have this opportunity, I'm also going to remove the spark arrestor screen for an inspection, and on this model, you don't even need any tools to remove it. It's as though they were expecting you to just take it out and throw it away, which would never happen. As you can see, the screen is very clean, and even though there is some buildup in the middle, I could clean it, but I doubt the screen will be on here much longer. It also looks like a mud dauber started to make a nest in this opening, which is for one of the bolts that holds the muffler to the engine. Now, even though this isn't going to do any harm because it's just covering up a bolt head, I'm going to try and clean it out. After that, I'm going to finish installing the carb to the engine. Now, I never understood the reasoning for this metal plate behind the air filter, but if I had to guess, I'd say it was a supporting structure to keep the filter base from breaking when this trimmer gets bumped and rolled around in the back of a truck. That's a pretty good design if that's the reason why it's there. The last thing we need to do is to get the covers back on and purge the fuel system, choke the carb, and then try starting it. The best part is that on this carb, if it has any starting or running issues, we'll be able to adjust the carb just like we're supposed to. Fortunately, the engine started and ran just like it should, and with the way it was running, I'm very pleased with the carb's default settings, so I'm not going to touch them. I will try and start them again when the engine is cold just to make sure everything is working the way it's supposed to. The reason is, when servicing the original carb, it has a tendency to need time to get back to a working condition, so if you make your initial settings, they may need to be changed the second or third time you start the machine to use it, but with a new carb, that doesn't happen all that often, and if it does, you don't need to change it by much. I'm not really sure what all happened to this edger, but I have a good idea, and I'm sticking with my original idea that someone replaced the carb with the wrong one. Now, the leak that was coming from it, I think, was always there. That's the reason why this edger looks to be in great condition. Now, I don't think it was used all that much before the carb was replaced, but afterwards, I think the leak kept them from using it much more. Fuel leaks on a machine like this one is a real issue, so unless you want to go up in flames, I'd recommend that you fix all your fuel leaks. If I get a good answer from the owner, I'll let you know, but most often they're just as much in the dark as I am when it comes to their machines, which is kind of a real shame. So my question is, would you have kept using this edger with a leaking carb? I know that sounds like a ridiculous question, but you'd be surprised by some of the responses, but some of you out there have seen it all and wouldn't be surprised at all. Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions about this project or about your own projects, and I hope to see you in the next video.